Japan is dying. It's not just its population that's shrinking, its economy is even worse. In 1980, 32 of the world's 50 biggest companies were Japanese. Well, by 2018, there was only one, Toyota. For decades, Japan has been struggling with low economic growth and productivity. It lost its head in consumer electronics years ago, and it feels like there are no world-famous Japanese tech companies. Like, seriously, off the top of your head, can you name one? So, I wanted to find out, what happened? How did Japan create an economic miracle in the first place? How did it stagnate to the point that adult diapers are outselling baby diapers? And with its next-door neighbor, China, growing into a global superpower, can Japan come back? To find out, I needed to do a deep dive into Japanese history, culture, and economics to learn why a country that was once on top of the world just a few decades ago has faded so fast. This is the real story of Japan's economic miracle and economic stagnation. Japan's economic miracle began on the worst day of the country's history. On August 6, 1945 at 8:15 a.m. local time, the United States detonated an atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, the US dropped a second bomb, this time over the city of Nagasaki. With its cities in ruins, its people terrified, and no prospect of winning the war, Imperial Japan soon surrendered. The end of World War II meant the end of Japanese sovereignty. Almost 1 million Allied soldiers, mostly Americans, participated in the occupation of Japan, the only time in the country's history it was ever occupied by a foreign power. After nearly 7 years and a profound transformation of the country's culture and institutions, the occupation ended, and Japan was welcomed back into the international community. But it took another war to make it a fully fledged Western ally, and to kickstart its miraculous economic recovery. On June 25, 1950, soldiers from the North Korean People's Army invaded South Korea in coordinated attacks along the 38th parallel, the line which divided the Communist North from the non-Communist South. The Korean War, the first major conflict of the Cold War, had begun. This was a proxy war, which meant that rather than directly participating on either side, the two global superpowers, the US and the USSR, instead supported opposing sides. The Communist North made shocking early advances. At one stage, they were even on the verge of capturing Seoul. But the tide began to turn soon after the US's intervention on behalf of the South. Desperate to not let Korea fall into Soviet hands, the US military shipped supplies from home. It soon became apparent that this was massively inefficient. So instead, it turned to the Japanese government for munitions and other supplies. Supplying US forces in Korea accelerated the reintegration of Japan into the global economy, while pushing it closer to the US sphere of influence. Great news, right? Well, not necessarily.
A picture from Tokyo of a mob getting out of hand. Spurred on, it's said, by left-wing students and trade unionists, they're forcing their way towards the Japanese Parliament building. They're demanding an end to Japan's security alliance with the United States, protesting against the presence of American troops in the country.
But before we dive into this topic, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because of the way the algorithm works, this video won't get far without your help. If you enjoy these kind of videos, your support would mean a lot for the channel. Alright, without further ado, let's get into the basics. The origins of what became known in Japan as the Anpo protests are complex. But they basically boil down to tensions over proposed changes to the US-Japan Security Treaty. The original version of the treaty was weighted heavily in favor of the US. It didn't specify an end date. It allowed US forces stationed in Japan to be used without prior consultation with the Japanese government. It had a clause specifically authorizing US troops to put down domestic protests. And it didn't commit the US to defend Japan if Japan was attacked. Have you ever heard the phrase, "history is written by the winners"? Well, so are the treaties. The revised treaty, which was signed in January of 1960, was seen as a significant improvement. In fact, Japan's Prime Minister, Nobusuke Kishi, was so confident that it would be ratified without any problems, he invited US President Dwight Eisenhower to visit Japan to celebrate its passage. But Kishi was wrong. The Japanese people were afraid that the treaty would lock Japan into supporting one side of a dangerous new global conflict. Seeing that there was significant opposition from the public, and even from his own party, Kishi instead chose to ram the treaty through Japan's parliament, the Diet, without any debate. Shocked, the Japanese people took to the streets. They took their inspiration from the neighboring South Korea, where a revolution had forced the US-backed strongman from power and showed that autocratic governments could be defeated by people power. At the climax of the protests, in June 1960, hundreds of thousands of protesters surrounded the Diet every day, while a nationwide strike saw more than 6 million workers walk off the job. The pressure became too much for Prime Minister Kishi to bear. Although he was ultimately successful in ramming the revised treaty through the Diet, the size and strength of the protests forced him to resign in disgrace. Kishi was replaced as leader of the Liberal Democratic Party and Prime Minister by Hayato Ikeda. Ikeda brought tons of his own baggage. In the 1950s, he gained a reputation as a distant technocrat who didn't care about normal people. He once suggested that people should eat more barley instead of expensive white rice, which was reported in the press, Marie Antoinette style, as "let the poor eat barley." He was forced to resign his position as Minister of International Trade and Industry after less than a month after. In reference to efforts to curb inflation, he was reported to have said that even if 5 or 10 small businessmen commit suicide, it can't be helped. Given all that baggage, the chances of Ikeda steering Japan out of an extremely turbulent time were low. But that's exactly what he did. And, just like the country he now led, Ikeda did it by reinventing himself. He switched out of his dark, double-breasted suits for more approachable attire. He adopted a gentler stance towards the political opposition, even adopting tolerance and patience as a campaign slogan. And, most dramatically of all, Ikeda announced a bold income doubling plan, promising to double the size of the Japanese economy in just 10 years by focusing on technological innovation, targeted investment in key industries, and boosting exports. I think the last of these is the most important. From the very beginning, Japan's leaders identified exports as the key to the country's economic recovery. In order to boost the country's exports, they pulled several levers. One of the most important was harnessing a key Japanese government agency, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, the MITI. Established in 1949, the MITI had two main goals: coordinating Japanese international trade policy and strengthening the country's industrial base. Today, we live in a neoliberal world. The free market decides. The thought of a government agency planning and coordinating economic development in such a deliberate way sounds almost socialist. But back in the 1950s and 1960s, with the world economy not nearly as integrated as it is today, and war still fresh in people's minds, the idea of the government coordinating economic development didn't really seem so crazy. One of the main examples was the exchange rate. Back then, instead of moving up and down because of supply and demand like it does today, it was fixed. This allowed the Japanese government to keep the value of the yen artificially low, which allowed it to keep the country's exports competitive on the world market. But the value of the yen wasn't the main reason the MITI became a champion in Japan's economic miracle. The main reason was that, by coordinating Japanese banking and industrial manufacturing sectors, it helped oversee the emergence of massive conglomerates called keiretsu. Let's address something that's been on my mind before we move forward. After watching my videos or other YouTubers' videos, I'm sure some of you guys have thought about starting your own channel. One of the biggest hurdles people face when starting a YouTube channel is that they are not comfortable showing their face in videos. Not everyone wants to give up their privacy and be in the public eye all the time. That's one of the big reasons why our videos are made in a documentary style. The craziest part is, people still love the videos, as you can see from the fact that we recently crossed 1 million subscribers. In fact, there are millions of faceless YouTube channels making content and earning ad revenue. In just the last 3 years, YouTube has paid out $70 billion to creators. That's around $60 million every single day. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, right now is the perfect time. That's why we've launched a completely free 7-day email crash course on how to start and grow a faceless YouTube channel. If that's something you're interested in, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. All right, now let's get back to the topic at hand. There are two types of keiretsu. Horizontal keiretsu are set up around a large Japanese bank, which has ownership stakes in other countries and lends them money at low rates. Have you ever wondered how Mitsubishi was able to make cars, air conditioners, chemicals, and even nuclear power? It's because Mitsubishi was actually a horizontal keiretsu, an autonomous group of interrelated companies with a common funding source. Then there are the vertical keiretsu. These link together suppliers, manufacturers, and distributors with a single industry. Multiple subsidiary companies are created to benefit the parent company. Think Toyota, Nissan, and Toshiba. As part of the incoming doubling plan, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry was influential enough to direct the keiretsu to focus on nationally significant sectors that were seen as vital prerequisites to Japanese industrialization. Steel production, shipbuilding, coal mining, chemical manufacturing, that kind of thing. The keiretsu are the first of the 4 magic ingredients of Japan's economic miracle. And one of the most significant decisions that Japanese businesses and government leaders ever made was to direct the keiretsu to achieve competitiveness in electronics. Japan already had extensive experience with the most important technology of the early electronics age, the transistor. Years earlier, Masaru Ibuka, the founder of a Japanese electronics company, learned that AT&T, the American firm that created the transistor, was about to start licensing it out for other companies to use. He traveled to the United States in search of ideas for products that used the transistor. He decided that the best early application would be a radio. In August of 1955, his company released the TR-55. It was the first commercially available radio in Japan. It was the first product released under the company's new name, Sony. Just 2 years later, Sony released the TR-63. Compared to the market leader, the TR-63 was smaller, more power efficient, and produced better sound. They were the first transistor radios to be exported. It was such a success that regular shipments couldn't keep up with demand. A Japan Airlines plane had to be specially chartered to air freight a large shipment. And in addition to being amazing technology, the TR-63 was also a triumph of marketing. Sony quickly realized that, despite it being branded as the pocket radio, the TR-63 was actually slightly too big for the average Japanese businessman's shirt pocket. Thankfully, Akio Morita, Sony's other founder, had a solution. He ordered custom shirts to be made for a salesman, featuring a slightly larger pocket. The TR-63 ended up becoming the first radio to sell more than 1 million units. And it gave Sony a beachhead in the world's biggest and most lucrative market, the US. It was a huge turning point for Sony, and for Japan more broadly. Emboldened by the success of the TR-63, 2 of Sony's main competitors, Sharp and Toshiba, decided to scale up production of their own transistor radios. By 1959, on the eve of Hayato Ikeda announcing the income doubling plan, more than 6 million Japanese transistor radio sets were sold in the US. That early success showed Japanese firms and the country's government the way. By the following year, Japan, by harnessing the power of the state to coordinate economic activity, was producing as many transistors as the United States. In order for the income doubling plan to succeed, Japan's GDP had to grow by about 7.2% a year. It was a big ask. In fact, the economic growth averaged more than 10% over the course of the 1960s. The income doubling plan was so successful that, in the words of one historian, it enshrined economic growthism as Japan's national secular religion. Japan's economic miracle was made possible because of incredible levels of coordination across all levels of society. Manufacturers, suppliers, distributors, and banks worked together in the keiretsu. Employers and employees worked together to ensure that productivity and job security both remained high. And overseeing it all was an interventionist government led by the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. The Japanese economic model, based on high-quality exports produced at scale and at low cost, became the blueprint for countries that wanted to quickly grow their economies. Japan became an inspiration for South Korea, China, and Taiwan when those countries had their own economic miracles. A proud nation had gone through hell, and they'd come out the other side clutching a Sony TR-63. But as important as the MITI and the Keiretsu were to Japan's economic miracle, they were still only a part of the answer. How did Japanese companies get so good at making these products? And how did they do it so fast? Japan's leaders knew that in order to achieve true prosperity, the country needed to become more proficient at making and exporting high-value products. But despite the country's incredible strengths, like the unprecedented level of cooperation across all levels of society, and the centuries-long tradition of small-scale manufacturing, Japan was still starting from a long way back. It needed some help.
The irony is that the staggering success of the Japanese was built on the principles of an American, a management intellectual largely ignored in his own country.
I believe that Dr. Deming has started a quality revolution. What he taught the Japanese can be done by any manager around the world who wants to make the effort. And that his revolution is as important, if not even more important, and certainly as drastic as the Industrial Revolution or even the Agricultural Revolution.
William Edwards Deming was an American engineer and business theorist who believed that statistics could be used to improve manufacturing and management. Deming's ideas were simple, but revolutionary. He believed that if a company's products were badly made, it was almost always the fault of the bosses that designed an inferior quality control system. Deming particularly criticized the dominant method of quality control used by most US manufacturers, who only inspected their products for defects after they were already made. Good management, he insisted, was about ensuring that the process created quality products from the beginning. Somewhat surprisingly, Deming's ideas didn't find much traction in his home country. Partially that was because, frankly, he wasn't very charismatic. He used dry language and didn't try hard to charm his audiences. But partially it was because, after World War II, the US didn't really need to hear his message of how they needed to be doing better. After all, consumers around the world wanted mass-produced American goods. In 1947, Deming was asked by the US Army to help with the Japanese census. If you're wondering why, remember the US was occupying Japan at this time. Before long, Deming was invited to speak at the Union of Japanese Scientists and Engineers, whose leaders wanted an expert to help them fast-track the country's reconstruction. Throughout 1950, Deming trained hundreds of engineers, industrialists, and managers in quality control concepts, including the likes of Akio Morita, Sony's co-founder. Deming's messages to Japanese chief executives was simple. Improving quality would reduce their expenses while also increasing their productivity and market share. It was music to the ears of business leaders who believed that, in order to rebuild their shattered country, they needed to become global exporters of high-quality products. Japan embraced Deming's ideas, and the man himself. In 1960, the Prime Minister awarded him the Order of the Sacred Treasure, a prestigious award given to the people who made long-term contributions to public service. Deming's message to Japanese business leaders might have fallen on deaf ears if not for Japan's centuries-long tradition of expertise in craftsmanship and manufacturing. Before you laugh at me in the comments, I know that Westerners talking about Japanese culture is a meme, gaijin and all that. But in this case, it's warranted. There's a concept in Japan called monozukuri. The literal translation is the act of making things, but it has a broader meaning. Monozukuri referred to a combination of progress, know-how, and a desire to innovate, shaped by centuries of belief in principles such as mindfulness, discipline, and the constant search for perfection. I'm not saying there's a gene that makes all Japanese people good at making stuff. I'm just saying that if you want to quickly grow your economy based on high-quality manufacturing, then it definitely helps to have a strong cultural affinity for making stuff. When you think about Japanese manufacturing, it's easy just to think about individual products like the TR-63 transistor radio, or the Toyota Corolla, or the Sony PlayStation. But some of the country's greatest innovations weren't products, they were processes. If you spent any time in the business section of a bookstore, you've heard of things like lean manufacturing and just-in-time production. Both these methods were based heavily on the Toyota production system, a system of organizational principles that was developed by the company's engineers after World War II. Something like the Toyota production system could have only been created by a country that took economic development seriously, that took William Deming's ideas seriously, and that took making things seriously. The US occupation was painful and humiliating, but it was also a source of new ideas that helped to challenge Japan's conventional thinking and, in a way, accelerated the country's modernization in the 20th century. All these things together, a focus on export-led development, embracing outside ideas, and embracing tradition, were what created Japan's economic miracle. They were all about to be combined into one project. In the early 1970s, IBM, the world's biggest computer company, released the System 370 series on mainframe computers. They represented a big step in computing technology. In response, the MITI forced the country's 6 largest electronics manufacturers into 3 paired groups. Hitachi and Fujitsu were paired together, as were Nippon Electronic and Toshiba, and finally Mitsubishi Electronic and Oki Electronic. Collectively known as the Sogo Denki, the General Electric's companies, they were some of the biggest businesses in Japan. And right away, the MITI faced a dilemma. As keiretsu, these companies were closely aligned with the government and financial sectors. But ultimately, they were still private sector firms, which meant they were still rivals. Japan's leaders knew that the only way their domestic computer industry could withstand the impact of IBM's new products, let alone flourish, was for the keiretsu to team up. Otherwise, they would all struggle to survive, because Big Blue was coming. When rumors that IBM was planning a new line of computers reached Japan in the late 1970s, the impact hit like a tidal wave. One of the leaders of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, said that, "We have too many computer makers in Japan to cope with the monster." The situation was clear: adapt or die. So, the Japanese government created a cooperative R&D research lab to study an advanced form of the microprocessor design known as Very Large-Scale Integration, VLSI, and basically forced the keiretsu firms to work together. The participating firms were offered significant subsidies, access to engineering talent, and easy access to capital. Learning VLSI techniques required overcoming major technical and scientific challenges, but the effort was worth it. As a result of the 4-year-long project, Japanese semiconductor technology caught up with IBM. In fact, in the words of the manager of the research lab, in some areas, Japan moved into first place, past IBM, and past the United States. The results were incredible. By 1982, just 2 years after the project wrapped, Japanese semiconductor companies were making more dynamic random access memory chips, or DRAM, than their American counterparts. They started spending more on facilities and R&D. By 1987, Japan had a 35% share of the world market for semiconductors, up from just 10% in the 1970s. A little more than 40 years ago, Japan's cities and its economy were in ruins, and now it was consuming more semiconductors than the United States, and putting them in cars and cameras and computers and other high-tech products. Again, the VLSI project is more of an example than an explanation, but it was an important example of how Japan's economic miracle happened. And unfortunately, not everyone was happy about it.
Japan bashing, even for congressmen, is the favorite new martial art.
Anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States throughout the 70s and 80s had lots of causes. Sometimes it was just pure racism or lingering resentment over World War II, but most of the time it was rooted in economics. It felt like the two countries were going in opposite directions. Japan was on the up and up, while almost every week there was news of another American plant or factory shutting down. The symptoms of US industrial decline were most obvious in the car industry, where the two countries competed directly. The big 3 car makers, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, watched in horror as consumers deserted them to buy cheaper, more fuel-efficient Japanese cars. Meanwhile, highly symbolic deals like the sale of famous American cultural symbols like Columbia Records and the Rockefeller Center building contributed to the sense that Japan was taking advantage of the US. The fears weren't entirely unfounded. The MITI really did provide subsidies to help Japanese semiconductor companies sell their chips at artificially low prices in overseas markets while keeping them high in Japan, a trade practice known as dumping. And the infamous footage of congressmen smashing Toshiba products on Capitol Hill, which was replayed endlessly on Japanese TV, came after the Japanese company illegally sold products to the Soviet Union through a shell company. Nor was the mood helped by provocative language like this, which was found from a Hitachi sales presentation to their staff based in Denver, Colorado. Quote, 10% below competition. If they requote, bid 10% under again. The bidding stops when Hitachi wins. Win with the 10% rule. Find AMD and Intel sockets. Quote, 10% below their price. If they requote, go 10% again. Don't quit until you win. Older Americans remembered when Hitachi made weapons which were used against them in World War II. Now, 40 years later, it sounded like it was encouraging its sales reps to fight another kind of war, a trade war. By 1985, America's trade deficit with Japan stood at about $50 billion, a combination of superior Japanese business practices and illegal, or, well, at least unethical, trade practices. Popular books with titles like MITI and the Japanese Miracle, and Japan is Number One, Lessons for America, suggested that America's leaders, managers, and workers could learn a lot. But even though no one at the time knew it, Japan had already hit its peak, and things were about to start going downhill, fast. Japan's economic decline has two causes. The first is financial. The second is cultural. Both are complex and closely related. And in this part of the video, I'll break them both down. Let's start with the financial side of things. That's where, in 1985, finance ministers and central bankers from the G5 group of major industrialized nations struck a deal to sell massive amounts of US dollars on world markets in order to drive down their value. A weaker US dollar meant, all else being equal, lower prices for US exports, and higher prices for the imports that were doing so much damage to American companies. Japan and Germany agreed to the deal because, although trade surpluses were in their short-term economic interests, they were creating tensions with their major Western allies. As a direct result of the Plaza Accord, the yen rose by 30% against the US dollar in just 1 year. And more importantly, it eventually caused Japanese exports to the US to fall by half. In order to avoid a potential recession, the Bank of Japan cut interest rates. That helped create an insane rise in the value of Japanese assets. From 1985 to 1986, average commercial land prices in Tokyo went up by about 122%. At the peak, prices in central Tokyo were so high that the 1.15 square kilometer Tokyo Imperial Palace grounds were judged to be worth more than all of the real estate in California. When the price of land in Tokyo became too ridiculous, investors just started buying up land in other major cities like Osaka, Yokohama, and Kyoto. The rising price of assets like land created a feedback loop where suddenly the price of Japanese stocks began to be determined more by asset prices than by business fundamentals. In 1986 alone, the Nikkei went up by 45%. On paper, increasing asset prices made companies' balance sheets look better, so investors responded by pouring more fuel on the fire. It looked like the market could only go up, and for a while that's what it did. The Nikkei kept climbing and climbing. By the end of the 1980s, 32 of the world's 50 biggest companies were Japanese. That was a sign of strength. But it was also a sign of weakness, because part of that value came from bloated asset values. What goes up inevitably must come down. Nervous about the unsustainable rise in asset values, the Bank of Japan actually began increasing interest rates again. Slowly but surely, the air began to escape the bubble. Land values crashed. The Nikkei fell by over 35% in 1990. Starved of capital or forced to suddenly repay loans at higher interest rates, and exposed by the fact that most of their appreciation had come from assets that had nothing to do with their actual business, many Japanese companies collapsed. Today, the Japanese refer to the 90s as the lost decade, because not only did they lose the opportunity to keep making progress, they also lost market share in some of the industries they were used to dominating. What Japan lost, other Asian countries gained. South Korea experienced its own economic miracle with Japanese characteristics, aided by lower labor costs and conglomerates like Hyundai and Samsung. Taiwan, led by state-of-the-art companies like TSMC, became the go-to destination for semiconductors. And then, of course, there was China, the sleeping giant awoken by leaders like Deng Xiaoping. All these countries studied Japan's miracles and applied the same lessons. Japan's government failed key moments and failed to adapt to a changing world, but so did Japan's companies. When they needed to innovate their way out of stagnation, they doubled down on the old ways of doing things. They wasted their incredible piles of cash on poor acquisitions like Columbia Records and the Rockefeller Center. And they underestimated the challenge from the country's regional neighbors. But a lost decade didn't totally explain why Japan's economy has stagnated for almost 30 years. To explain that, I'll turn to the second part of my explanation of what happened to Japan. In a single word, culture. As you already know, Japan has an incredibly rich culture which stretches back thousands of years. That culture has been a source of stability and continuity in tough times. But the same culture that's a guardrail can also be a handbrake against progress. Often, those workplaces are exactly the same keiretsu I talked about earlier in the video. Because of their size and their complex structure, they tend to be quite conservative. Values like conformity, fitting in, or tradition are often valued over efficiency and entrepreneurship. It's not just big workplaces either.
This is a hanko, and it's often used in Japan in place of a signature. For example, on contracts or invoices or other official documents.
大切なことは面倒くさい方がいいと僕は思ってるんですよ。そのデジタル社会の怖いところは、その犯罪者が世界に出ちゃうこと。
Think for a moment about the products we associate with Japan's economic miracle. The Walkman, the Corolla, the Game Boy. All of them draw on monozukuri, the Japanese tradition of excellence in craft manufacturing. They're mechanical products that rely on hardware. But increasingly, that's not the world we're living in. And although it's true that the digital world can be scary, it's also where many of the modern world's innovations and new ideas are. I asked in the intro if you can think of a Japanese tech firm. Well, you've had about 20 minutes. Did you think of one? You kind of think that Japan would excel in software. After all, it's an industry where precision and quality matter. We're talking about the country that gave the world the Toyota production system. But Japan has never really operated on the cutting edge of software development. It's partially structural. The keiretsu of other large Japanese businesses just weren't set up to encourage innovation. But it had a lot to do with culture. Historically, Japan has been somewhat resistant to change from outside. Sometimes this has led to absolutely crazy situations.
For some government procedures today, you're still required to submit application in floppy disk.
I think there's a lesson to be learned that two of the key events which ultimately led to Japan's 20th century economic miracle, the Anpo protests and William Deming's lectures to the country's business leaders, involved demanding that things change. A lot of economists believe Japan's failure to make the transition from the analog to the digital is the main reason why it's fallen behind countries like the US. But it's definitely not the only one. Japan's rigid, process-oriented work culture not only prioritizes conformity over efficiency and entrepreneurship, it also forces people to work incredibly long hours, which prevents many of them from starting families. And that brings me full circle to the observation I began this video with. Adult diapers are outselling baby diapers. Japan's demographics are in crisis. We have a full detailed video on this issue alone, but here's a quick overview. The baby boomers are retiring, and people, for a bunch of reasons, aren't having enough babies to replace them. Plus, the country's ultra-restrictive immigration policy means that there aren't enough new Japanese people coming into the country. As a result, the share of the working-age population is declining. In fact, the whole country is shrinking. Japan's population today is about 125 million. At current rates, that's expected to shrink to 107 million by 2040, and 97 million by the middle of the century. Young people and immigrants bring new ideas and challenge old ways of thinking. You can't shape the future if you won't be around for it. I think the story of Japan's rise and fall is inspiring and heartbreaking and instructive. With the right set of policies and coordination across all levels of society, it's possible to massively grow your country's economy and prestige on the world stage. But when the world changes and requires a different approach, you need to be flexible enough and open-minded enough to change. While doing research for this video, I learned a joke about how Japan is stuck in the past. How do you know someone works for a Japanese company? Because when you look at their business card, it still has their fax number. I'm not saying it's a great joke, but it definitely has a grain of truth to it. Earlier I said that in 1989, 32 of the world's 50 biggest companies were Japanese. That wasn't necessarily good news, because it was partially the result of artificially inflated balance sheets. But still, it was a measure of the country's economic dominance. Well, by 2018, there was only one: Toyota. Japan's economic miracle really did happen. But now, the country's dark age has lasted for almost as long as its golden age. For Japan to bounce back, it needs to open itself to new ideas and new people. It needs to adapt the culture that has served it so well for centuries, so that a glorious past can also inspire a glorious future. I really hope it can.
After watching this video, don't forget to give it thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon to get notified whenever we post new content. Your support means a lot and helps our team create more videos like this. Thanks for watching.